Good evening, everyone. We'll just wait for a few more people to come in and then we'll get started. We're so glad that you're here with us this evening. So this is our second roundtable session in our second season of Challenging Discrimination on intersectionality and social inclusion. We'd like to take this time to thank our funder, the Edmonton Community Foundation, who've made it possible for us to continue this program this year. And we'll just wait for a few more people to come in. Okay. Well, I'll just say one more time for the people who have joined us since. Welcome to our second roundtable session of our second season of Challenging Discrimination. Tonight we'll be learning about intersectionality and social inclusion. And we'd like to take this time to thank our funder for this series, which is the Edmonton Community Foundation. Next. So tonight we're in conversation with Sam Singh, social innovator from Shift Lab, and Sogand Zakerhaghighi, mental health healer and business owner of SZ Wellness Incorporated. Next. So we'd like to take this time to do a land acknowledgement. So we're gathered here today on Amiskwaci-Waskaikan, traditional Treaty 6 territory of the First Nations and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Zone 4. We respectfully acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this land for generations, including the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota, Blackfoot, as well as the Métis and Inuit. This land is and has been a welcoming place for all peoples who come to Edmonton and call it home. It is a place built for community, trade, friendship, and shared understanding. We recognize those Indigenous peoples who are still fighting for equality today, and we support them in the spirit of decolonization and reconciliation. We remain committed to honoring the struggle of our Indigenous siblings and joining with them to end injustice. Today, we call upon all of our collective honored traditions and ancestors to help us work together in the spirit of community and understanding today and onwards. Why we do land acknowledgements. We are all treaty people. Long ago, when the first settlers came to this land, they drafted treaties that Indigenous peoples signed in goodwill and in good faith. Those settlers and settlers up until today have not always honored those treaties. The treaties were meant to honor the traditional land and way of life of the Indigenous peoples, to ensure their rights and prosperity, and to build mutual understanding and cooperation. Today, we acknowledge the treaty lands as a way to recommit to honoring the spirit of those treaties and to recognize the continued rights of Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land. We recognize that many Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed of their land and traditional ways of life, and along with it, the prosperity that came with those. We acknowledge the treaty to understand that we each have a role to play as treaty people in reconciliation and in righting the historical wrongs that have taken place. If you would like, we invite you to share your land acknowledgements based on the treaty areas you're residing in the chat box. Next, I'll tell you a little bit about Cfrac. Since its establishment in 1993, the Centre for Race and Culture, formerly known as the Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and encouraging individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. We take an intersectional approach, and our expertise spans from workplace development to community building, research, and education. If you're interested in learning more about our current events, projects, and activities, please visit our website or sign up for our newsletter. And I'll tell you a little bit about this program. So this session is part of our new initiative entitled Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations, an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers from diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public. We're looking to understand and explain, address experiences of discrimination and exclusion in the Canadian context. By shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, like anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and discrimination against Asian communities, among other topics, we really hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals by promoting strategies for education, intervention, and allyship. So next. So this is a community-based initiative, and we're looking and welcoming any ideas or suggestions that you have for collaboration. Please don't hesitate to reach out to my colleague Ben Sray. Her email is below. If you're interested in being a part of or have suggestions for future conversations, we also will be providing a feedback form at the end of the event where you can share your thoughts or any other questions you have with us. So now we'll launch a quick Zoom poll just to collect some anonymous demographic data. You don't have to answer, but if you do, it helps us to understand our audience better. So this will just take a moment here, folks. So yes, thank you all for answering these questions. We really appreciate it. It's very helpful to us as we plan upcoming and future sessions to understand more about you guys, about you all. Okay. So next, I will introduce you to our speakers and our moderator for this event. I'm so happy to introduce to you Samir Singh. Samir Singh is a social innovator and steward at the Edmonton Shift Lab. He's worked for EndPovertyEdmonton as a strategic planner, a coordinator for the World Indigenous Nations Games, as well as the government of Alberta and Strathcona County as a systemic designer. He is the co-founder of the Rotman Design Challenge at the Rotman School of Management, and he currently works in the real estate industry. He is passionate about building community. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Sogand Zakerhaghighi. I apologize, Zakerhaghighi. Sogand is an Iranian Canadian who holds a master's degree in counseling and a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology. She has also attained various certifications in health and wellness lifestyle coaching, cyber counseling, as well as art therapy life coaching. She is the owner of SZ Wellness Inc., and she uses her professional expertise and extensive academic background to conduct individual, couple, and family wellness sessions focused on healing and growth. Further than this, Sogand facilitates workshops on intersectional, trauma-informed mental health to service providers, nonprofit organizations, and academic or government institutions on local, national, and international scales. Lastly, I'd like to introduce you to Cfrac's very own and our moderator this evening, Litsi Baiza. Litsi has worked in the field of international education for the past 15 years, managing a variety of projects overseas, primarily in Latin America. She started her work in the intercultural field in 2001, when working with students from Asia and Latin America and helping them adjust to Canadian society. Litsi specializes in intercultural competency, cross-cultural intelligence, diversity, equity and inclusion, and anti-racism education and consulting. She also teaches an online course on cross-cultural intelligence at NATE. Litsi has her master's in Latin American Studies at the University of Chile, where her primary focus of research for her thesis and other publications was the Chilean exile to Canada. She also has a BA in psychology from a university in Canada. She has received training from the Summer Institute of Intercultural Communication in Portland, Oregon, and has completed a certificate in Intercultural and Diversity Studies through the University of British Columbia. Besides her experience in Canada, Litsi has lived and worked in Chile, Mexico, and Cuba, and is fluent in Spanish. Litsi was a board member for the Center of Race and Culture from 2018 through 2020, and she has joined us most recently as a facilitator. She is now our EDI education specialist, focusing on racial equity projects and EDI training for various organizations. So I'll turn it over to Litsi, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Serafina, for all those introductions. So we're going to start our session today with asking the question, how do you define intersectionality and why it is important to take an intersectional approach when we discuss social inclusion topics? And perhaps we'll start with Sogand first.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. So I work in the mental health field. So intersectionality for me looks like everybody experiences trauma differently. We may all have had the exact same exposure to something, and depending on our upbringing, our race, our gender, our sex, our age, our socioeconomic status, our religious affiliation, and so on, we will experience what we just saw, the one thing that we all just saw, very differently. So intersectionality to me is the way in which we all experience life is very different. And we cannot look over those many different identities that create the package of who we see. And that is how I work in my systems with all of my clients and in my workshops. Intersectionality is always embedded.
Great, thank you so much. What about the second question? Why is it important to take an intersectional approach when we discuss social inclusion topics?
Because if we don't, then are you still asking me, right?
Yes, yes.
Because if we don't, then we are excluding people. We must recognize that people have not always had a voice. People have been spoken for. People's spaces have been taken up by other people. If we don't recognize that an intersectional approach is the only way, honestly, it's the only way, we will continue to leave people out of this conversation.
Thank you so much for your response. Sam, what about yourself?
Yeah, I would agree with Sogand's definitions. I think there's kind of many ways to explain intersectionality. And I was trying to think of one that, kind of approaches it from a different angle. So I was thinking about a game that I played when I was in high school and am now playing again as an adult, and it's called Dungeons and Dragons. And what happens is it's a make-believe game. You roll dice and you make up scenarios in your head. But in Dungeons and Dragons, you have 6 sort of characteristics: strength, dexterity, constitution, wisdom, charisma, and intelligence. And these are supposed to create your character. And the way I think of it with intersectionality is that if you have high scores in any of these categories, that makes solving the problems that you face much easier. So if you are playing a game, a Dungeons and Dragons game where there's a lot of fighting involved and you're fighting bad guys and monsters, if you have high strength and dexterity and constitution scores, those will help you. Whereas if you have more of a cerebral type game where you are trying to solve problems, solve puzzles and whatnot, then having things like high intelligence and wisdom and charisma will help you. And the numbers on their own don't necessarily mean a lot, but it's the context in which that you are playing the game that actually having a high score will give you a greater chance of success than a low score. So similarly, I think of instead of a D&D world, if you're talking about systems, like the justice system or the healthcare system or mental health or family court, in an ideal world, it would be great to say that everyone is treated the same, but we know in reality that isn't always true. And that if you have high scores, so quote unquote, in terms of things like wealth or education or gender, for example, the balance of success is more heavily weighted towards you than it would be with somebody else, even though the two of you may be in the exact same scenario, the exact same situation. Just by the nature of the characteristics that you bring to the table, those will have an influence before the question is even asked. And so that's just kind of an offshoot way I think of intersectionality.
That's a great way to think of it. Thank you for that example and definition, and link back to a game that maybe some of you already recognize or know. So that's really helpful, Sam. What about the second question? Why is it important to take an intersectional approach when we do discuss social inclusion topics?
I mean, I would again echo what Sogand said, that I can't really foresee how you would manage to solve any social problem without taking into account intersectionality. Because, the example I think of is a common question that comes up, especially between men and women, is why are women always so cold in office buildings? And I don't know if maybe you've encountered this scenario before. And it comes down to, when you trace it, it comes down to, if you've ever seen the show Mad Men, where you see that the office in North America in the 50s and 60s was designed for primarily white men. And they would be white men wearing suits. So they would go into an office, they'd all wear suits, no matter what their job occupation was. And so the temperature system buildings were designed with that as their stereotypical client in mind. It would be a man, most often a white man, but a man in a suit. And so they'd be wearing layers of clothing, and the temperature in that environment was created to suit that type of user. And that's why, oftentimes you'd hear in this example of women being cold, because these systems were not designed for what they're wearing in terms of how they work in that office space. And so to me, when you look at intersectionality, basically you're just using a wider lens to include not just who you think your stereotypical client or customer might be, but anyone you could potentially imagine that might be in the scenario that you're envisioning.
Great, that's great. Thank you so much. Let's move to the second question. We'll start with Sogand. How do you practice social inclusion in your work using an intersectional framework or lens?
So my services, I work on a sliding scale, which I think is very intersectional in its approach. Mental health services, as we know, are not accessible. They're not always affordable. Wait lists are very long, so people often spend a lot of time, and sometimes they get discouraged, right? And so I offer a sliding scale, that's number one. And so basically, if they can't afford, the clients can't afford my set rates, I will work with them to see how we can make it work. That's number one. Number two, I really do believe when it comes to mental health that we have the knowledge, school smarts. I say this all with, quotations, because even that I have little issues with anyways. So you can see I'm a little, like, in everything I do, I'm very intersectional, because even what I just said is like, well, but when I work with my clients, I don't think I'm the expert of the story. Yet I hear from them when they've worked with other mental health professionals, sometimes they've been made to feel that they're not the expert of their story, that the person offering the support or the services, and that's just not the truth. And I feel like in the mental health world, we have a long way to go in which we actually prioritize the stories of the people we're working with and recognize that we, again, know the book smarts, but we don't know all the answers and we don't know everything there is to know. And we need to do a lot more listening and a lot less talking, because I think we take up too much space sometimes as mental health professionals.
Thanks. Thank you for your response. Sam, how about you?
I would say that with what we do in the Shift Lab, a typical rule of thumb we might use is design for the margins. So design for people who are, like I said before, are not going to be necessarily your stereotypical user, but they will be somebody who you might overlook in how they might use the system or how they might move within that system. I know we're talking about race, but another example I think of is disability. So disability exists within my family, and oftentimes it's not visible. So it's not something that people can, identify from the outset. But I think it's just as valid and as important a characteristic that you have to kind of incorporate so that people, regardless of whatever, whatever category of intersectionality they're in, that when they come to you, that you're able to offer the same service as you would to anyone who, might not have any particular, characteristics holding them back, or any sort of, characteristics that might limit their participation in whatever activity you're undertaking.
Great. Are there any examples that you can provide, any of you, this question is for any of you, where you've taken an intersectional? I know, Sam, you kind of mentioned an example, but maybe another concrete example where you've taken an intersectional framework lens and used it in the work that you do.
I can share the brochure that we're working on, but I can also let Sogand go first if she's got a category where will I figure out the technicalities of it.
So I think I do it all the time, right? Especially, let's talk about the workshops that I do. I conduct workshops for service providers all the time. And when I do that, intersectionality is always, I have a slide on intersectionality. I explain what that is, and I explain what that has to do. Sometimes I'll do it on like self-care, for example. Let's talk about self-care and intersectionality. The fact of the matter is not everybody has the same access to self-care. When we talk about take care of yourself, it's a very blanket approach, right? Not everybody can afford a gym membership. Not everybody can afford to, go get bath bombs. We can't afford these things. So we have to figure out as mental health professionals when we are conducting one-on-one sessions or in like a workshop setting, how do I give practical, intersectional, tools to people that are attending my workshop and not assume that everybody can just go to the gym. And we're talking ableism, right? Like Sam just said, right? We're talking finances, we're talking access to resources. Not everybody has that. And so when I present for self-care, I have to be very mindful of, okay, I'm giving tools and resources to people, but can people actually use this? Can they take this presentation and actually go, and they're usually service providers, right? So can they go to the hospital that they come from? Can they go to the school and give it to everybody? If they can't, I'm not being intersectional, even though I have a slide that says intersectionality.
Great, thank you for that. Sam?
Well, Sogand was talking about wellness, and to me, I just think of the idea of when the pandemic started, there was a lot of people saying we're all in this together. Yeah. And that I think was said from the vantage point of somebody who's like, oh, I'm just stuck at home working on my laptop, watching Netflix in the evening. We're all suffering together. And I'm like, well, no, because the most likely racialized person who's delivering you your food and is bringing you all the comforts you need to live at home, while you're working at home, isn't in the same fight. And I think we saw that, with the meatpacking plant in southern Alberta, or some of the COVID numbers in Ontario of how people who are racialized are often at the front lines, whether it's healthcare providers, nurses, and whatnot, taking care of people in seniors' homes, or if it's people working at the grocery store, the Uber drivers. I mean, those are the ones who they're the essential workers that basically kept the rest of the economy functioning over the past 18 months. And it's obvious to anyone that there's a vast difference between somebody who has to come into contact and put themselves at risk from COVID versus, a large majority, maybe not the majority, but a large portion of the population that was just at home working on the computers all day.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks. Good points. Did you want to mention a little bit about the bystander framework, or did you want to leave that for?
No, I can bring that up. So I'm going to try and share the screen. I'm not super adept at Zoom, so I'm hoping this works. I think the share screen has been turned off. I have a physical copy, though, that I can show, if that helps. So one of the things we do at the Shift Lab is we're looking at ways to make positive impacts in people's fights against racism, in whatever environment that is. And one of the things we did is we created a thing called the Guide to Bystander Intervention. And so this is meant for people who, if you see something happening in a public place, we've seen videos of people being harassed on, in the train station or on a bus or whatnot. We came up with kind of a short guide, 8 pages, about what else you can do beyond just recording it on your phones, because that's what people most often do. And, it's got, we've got like a kind of a cartoon that kind of indicates somebody's real story here in Edmonton about how they were harassed on the LRT. And one of the things we noticed is that there's a lot of overlap between racial harassment and sexual harassment. And I think especially for myself and for a lot of men, it's kind of something that is a stumbling block that we didn't really have when it comes to these issues. We did a consultation with a group of Muslim women, some, South Asian, African Muslim women. And, we had a list of and you've probably seen this, it's a list of things that I do to keep safe. And for women, it's probably 30 different things. I have my cell phone with me, carry keys when I'm walking to my car at night, just a complete list. For the men, there was just one statement that said, I never thought about that before. And it's true because, based for most men, it's not something we ever had to consider. And when I was in university, I have a deep history, a love of history. And so I took, at one point I took a women's studies course, and it was like eye-opening because this is 20 years ago, but it still resonates with me today, because up until that point, I didn't even know the class, but just at one point a light went off in my head, and I realized all the history I've read has been written by men, about men, for men. And it just completely blew my mind that, it's not even necessarily white men. Yeah, if you're reading European history, but if you're reading, Indian history, Japanese history, it's the same thing. And it really kind of shocked me when I realized that up until this point in time, I just kind of was taught that this is how it is. This is the way the world is. And so that basic realization is something that we tried to put into this brochure, so that we are incorporating the perspectives of women and gender fluid individuals who are going to experience the world in a much different way than I would as a man.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll be sharing that resource with everyone after the session for sure. Thank you. The next question that we have is, how can we use intersectionality to foster more social inclusion in our communities, perhaps in the work that you both do in your organizations or in your private work? What do you think are ways that we can use an intersectionality framework or lens to be more socially inclusive in our communities?
Should I go first? Sam looks like he's thinking.
Sure.
So for me, like I said earlier, I think as mental health professionals, we need to do more listening and less talking. As mental health professionals, we usually are the ones at the podium. We're usually the ones that speak. We usually are the ones that offer expert advice, And I think that we need to oftentimes just sit down and listen to the people that we are serving, right? To the people that we are trying to help, because we don't always know the answers. And it's not, when it comes to intersectionality with mental health, it's definitely not one size fits all. Absolutely not. And what can be super helpful for somebody in their healing and wellness journey can be extremely traumatizing and triggering for somebody else. And you as a mental health professional, if you have just a blanket way of treating all your clients the exact same way, you will miss that and you will probably do some harm. And so for me, it's always more listening. So I will tell you in my one-on-one wellness sessions, I end every session with, how does this sit with you? Where are your energy levels at? How was this session? I always want to make sure that they leave the session with me, whether it's a half an hour session or a full hour session, having taken, we talked about difficult stuff, but I want to make sure their energy is always better than the way they came in. I always want to make sure if there's room for them to tell me. And if there is, and I really think that we need to be able to have transparency. And I always want them to tell me, and they'll tell me sometimes, actually, Sogand, journaling does not work for me. I tried it. You told me to try it. It didn't work. Give me something else. And it bothers me when they tell me that they were never able to tell their previous mental health professional that hey, that didn't work for me. I know so many people who worked with other mental health professionals, and they'll be like, I just did what they told me to do, even though it didn't help, and I didn't speak up. And the fact that they didn't feel comfortable to speak up tells me we have a long way to go. So I think we need to offer space, and whether it's one-on-one work, whether it's group work, offer space for people to give us feedback and actually take accountability and responsibility, because there is a power dynamic, and I think we need to do more listening.
Great, thank you so much. Sam?
Yeah, I would reinforce that idea that, if when in doubt, just listen more, speak less, because it's always important to listen to other people's perspectives. And, I just think of, in the technology sector, because I think the tech industry is particularly bad for this. When, they come up with all these, wonderful new innovations, but without thinking about how others might use it. So for example, facial recognition software is becoming really big now. But we're also learning that, it doesn't recognize certain skin pigmentations. And that can be, if you're trying to get, soap from a soap dispenser, I mean, that can be a minor annoyance. But if we're talking about these systems being used, you know, in surveillance and criminal justice and in other contexts, these differences aren't just annoyances, they can become much more significant. And it's something that I think about, you know, I'm always keeping my mind open for it because, for example, I saw a commercial for, you know, the Amazon store of the future, where, and maybe you've seen the commercial where he just walks around in a supermarket, grabs things, and then just like walks out of the store. And people are, you know, the idea is that he's not shoplifting, everything's been scanned on his wallet. So, you know, he's just grabbing what he needs. The transaction takes place on his wallet as he walks through. There's no need to stop. It doesn't even need a receipt. And then somebody posted, I'm a person of color, and if I walk out of a store with a bunch of goods and I don't have a receipt, that can be real trouble for me. And so it's another reminder that for a lot of people in the tech sector, especially people who do come from privilege, you know, who don't have these issues, they can be just completely blindsided to how somebody else, because of their gender or race or ethnicity or the language they speak or their able-bodied status, will experience what they think is a, you know, utopian solution in a very different way.
Right. Thank you so much. And we do invite questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please make sure that you're putting it in the chat right now. We have ended with our portion of the questions, but I do have a few other questions myself. So when we talk about, you define intersectionality, you talked about how it's important to, use it to foster social inclusion in our communities. You talked a little bit about what you've done in your own work to use intersectionality. And perhaps could you provide us with more detail on how you can use it in practical way? Is there a set of questions you can ask? What steps would you need to take if you're working with people from varying backgrounds, diverse factors, for example, to understand a little bit more about how their different identities intersect, for example? So maybe just for the audience, some concrete kind of practical action or tools that you can use to really get that part of intersectionality working with the people that you work with in your communities. I hope that made sense.
Mm-hmm. It did. Do you want to go first?
Or sure, whatever. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So for me, I'm very blunt and transparent in everything I do. And so I would honestly ask, like, how does this impact you? Like, not you as a representative of this community, not you as a representative of these people, but just like you, like individual to individual. How does this impact you? And then once they tell you, like, I have financial barriers and it's like, I can't afford it. Or, I'm not able-bodied, or it's something, I have a invisible disability. I even hate the word disability. I feel like that's a problem too. But I have something that personally that blocks me from accessing this resource. I think we need to really ask, like, how does it impact you? Because I think oftentimes we feel like people are just like representative of like the greater mass of people. And then that's how we silence people again, right? That's how we exclude people, because privilege, right? Bias, projection, these are very powerful things. And I just feel like we need to just ask folks like directly, how does this impact you and how can I help you? Like, how can, after hearing how it impacts them, so like, for example, like I said, affordability, accessibility, a lot of my clients will tell me, so again, I don't feel comfortable with Google Meets. I have trauma with Google Meets. Okay, you want to try Zoom? Sure. That one client likes Zoom. Nobody likes Zoom in my sessions. But I do have like one or two clients that are very adamant we use Zoom. That's what I mean. So I will listen to them. Right? Some clients don't have an iPhone. FaceTime doesn't work. Okay, does Instagram work? You use Instagram a lot. Yeah, okay, we'll use Instagram. So that's what I mean. You gotta tailor, I think, the service to that client, not that client as a representative of all the different intersectionalities that they have.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really meeting people where they're at.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sam.
Yeah, I mean, meeting people where they're at is exactly what you have to do. And I think this can be frustrating for policymakers because it ends up being, this means you have to slow the process down. and you have to kind of take your time with individuals. Another example of a Shift Lab product that we're coming out with soon is we're coming out with a board game that sort of tells the history of Treaty 6 from an Indigenous perspective. And so this is called Exploring Wakotawin, and we're hoping it'll be out in the maybe fall or spring. And the idea is you represent an Indigenous family in central Alberta after Treaty 6 has been signed. And you are trying to basically survive the encroachment of settlers who are now coming to your traditional territory. And the things that you value aren't gold or money or land. It's things like ceremony and the bison and berries. And this is information that we gleaned from our Indigenous partners that we worked with. But that all came through relationship building. That all came from investing time to really establish a level of trust where you can have these conversations that really indicate this is what this community needs and wants. It's not something like a survey where you can check a box and you send this out to 1,000 people and then you're like, okay, now I know what this community wants. It is slow. So, I mean, it does take time, but honestly, I think that's the only way you're going to get genuine, real responses.
Agreed. And all of this is really, intentional practices that a lot of times take time, and a lot of organizations don't want or don't have the time to really focus on these issues. We have a question from the audience. How does intersectionality work with inclusion in our workplace? Thank you, Ford. Sam, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I mean, at first glance, I would say that you can't have one without the other. That you can't really have an inclusive working environment or any kind of collaborative environment unless you are taking into account what everyone else is bringing to the table, and all the various identities that they have. And some of them, will have more relevance to, the job at hand or the workplace that you're in than others. But you still need to have a sense of what everyone is experiencing. So, it's the question's not super specific, but if I can think of working in a government department or in a system or whatnot, if there are people who are new to Canada or new to Alberta, they're immigrants, or they're often bringing extremely valuable experience of how these systems work in another environment. And it doesn't mean that exactly everything they've learned can work in this particular situation, but there are surely insights and observations and value to what they're bringing into this environment that you can learn from, especially if you're trying to improve a system or make a system more responsive to the people it serves.
Great, thank you so much for that. Sogand.
I think that's a great question. It made me think a little bit. I'm glad Sam went first, because I had to think about that. I think that, yes, in a perfect world, I think that they are synonymous terms. However, I don't think that's the way it always works out. I think that oftentimes a lot of companies will say that they're inclusive, but again, they'll just have like one person that is like of a different race, of a different gender, uses a different pronoun. And then again, they're like used as like the staple and like a representative. And that's where intersectionality kicks in. And it's like, well, actually they're not, they're just representative of themselves. And so the way I do that is whenever I show up to, for example, panel conversations, I always make it clear that, I'm a veiled woman, but my experience is very different than every other veiled woman on this planet. And most of them are not, because, we know that not just Muslim women veil. There's a lot of women of different faiths and traditions that veil. And so I don't show up as a representative of all these veiled women when I talk about intersectionality of a veiled woman, because we can't, right? And so the way I do it is I just always make it clear, like I'm speaking as Sogand, and we need to just listen again to the different perspectives, even if these people all look very similar to you. For example, veiling looks similar, maybe. It's not a similar experience. And so I think that we need to just recognize that people all have very different experiences, which is intersectional. And for inclusivity to actually take place, we need to be able to just take the, just listen and like see that people are taking their space, give them the space, and just see what they have to say.
Great.
And just recognize that that's what they have to say as a person. Unless they, of course, say like, I'm a nominated human being of this X community, then it's a different story,
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I invite the audience to throw in other questions that they might want to ask the panelists. We have some time still. One of the questions I had was, we might have folks here from different organizations, from different communities, doing work around diversity and inclusion. What are your thoughts around, or what are your tips if they're wanting to do more of an intersectional lens or intersectional framework in their work? What do you think they can start with to start some of that work?
Should I go first? Sam looks like he's thinking again.
Yeah, I'm thinking of something.
I think that bringing in speakers who practice intersectionality, diversity, and inclusion in their everyday is good. I think it's important, like, for example, all these things that Sam's talking about is things I didn't really think about because I don't work in tech and I don't work in like creating pamphlets that are so cool. I don't do that. And so like, I think it would be nice to have him and me to come and talk, because we have two very different perspectives. We have commonalities, we have some common denominators, but our actual experiences are very different. And I think that having people from different walks of life, yes, but doing this work in different ways is really important, because then you're actually, the more the merrier, right? The more people you bring in, the more perspectives, the more you can say like, we're actually really prioritizing diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality, because look at all the people that we bring in. And like, also like anybody else, like who else wants to bring in? And this is time consuming. Yes. It is energy. Yes. It is money. Yes. But then you can actually say that you're practicing what you preach.
Great. Thank you. Sam?
I would say, as best as you can, it's good to know who your audience is. And try and just take a moment to think about who is coming to you for whatever particular purpose. So, for example, if we're looking at, and we kind of did this at the beginning with that poll question. So we have a sense of the ages of people who are attending, the genders, potentially questions about occupation, or, other questions that can kind of help you understand your audience a bit better. And then, oftentimes a fun game in the design world is to now like flip that around, like pretend that everyone is a different gender, or pretend that instead of, everyone being, 18 to 25, they're 75 to 80. And just think in your mind, to use that as an exercise to think, okay, how would I change my delivery if I was dealing with a bunch of 25-year-olds versus a bunch of 75-year-olds?
Yep.
And just use that as a quick way to kind of think, how would that affect your work? And you can do it in a number of different ways. You can imagine everybody's middle class. Okay, well, what if everybody's working poor, or what if everyone's upper middle class? How would that change? How would you flip that lens in terms of what you're planning on doing with this group or this audience?
Great. Thank you so much. Really understanding the demographics of who you're working with is important. We have a question in the question and answer box from James. He asks, how can cohesion be achieved in the face of intersectionality? Who would like to go first?
I can go first. I can take a stab at it. I think James's question is a good one, because I think there's kind of a tension that I think Sogand also touched on is, we're all human beings, but every one of us is different. So how do you, if you've got, everyone is we're all human here and everyone's a unique individual here, where do you find yourself in the balance where you can respect the fact that everyone is an individual, but we're all human beings and we all have similar needs? And I mean, I think it's very context dependent. so I can't give you an answer. It's like, oh, it's right here. Here's the answer. But I think it's a good question because I would say in the work that we do, we kind of try to keep an eye on what's the goal, what's the greater good, what is it that as a collective, as a group, what are we striving for? So, for example, if with this bystander intervention guide, we are trying to empower people so that they can feel encouraged to do something when they see something like violence or harassment happening, out of the corner of their eye, rather than feeling like they can just stand and watch or wait or whatnot. We want to give them some tools that allow them to say, here's how you can make a difference. And here's how you can make your community safer, whether it's in this one instant or whether it's something that you do every day that you keep in mind. Here's a way to do it. And so I feel like having a sense of what the greater objective is a good way of keeping that coherence.
Great, thank you. Sogand.
I agree with Sam. I think that I just want to touch on a couple of things that he said many times, but I'm just going to bring it back up. So he said, having a common goal, totally. Having people polls are good, feedback is good. This is all very good. And so I know it can be a scary thought that everyone has a space to talk now. How are we going to create cohesion? And we might not always create cohesion. And I don't think that should be something that we're scared of, right? I think it's okay for us to accept that sometimes there is going to be differences. Sometimes we need more than one approach. Sometimes we need more more opportunity for people to speak up. And sometimes there's going to be differences. That's okay. But I think that the more people speak up, the more we will see there's actually similarities and there's actually common grounds, right? So, for example, when I do I presented a workshop to Mac Islamic School, right, for self-care for teachers, right? The objective is self-care for teachers. I recognize not every single teacher has the same lived experience, right? And so, but the objective is the same, right? And so when I give, for example, whenever I do these kind of workshops, I always have activities so that they can sit with themselves and be like, okay, she's giving us tools, but how is this going to work in my life, right? And then they'll give me their feedback, and I just got 50 different answers, right? And that's okay. That can look like something scary to someone, but I think that's great. Differences are great. We can learn from differences. So like he said, objectives important, holding space for other people is important. And I think not being scared of the fact that cohesion might not always happen, but at least people have an opportunity to speak up and they can take space. I think that's what's important.
Great, thank you so much. We do have another question from someone in the audience. And the question is, I'm just putting it here in the chat box, how intersectional are we as a community? And do you think we're moving towards social inclusion in our community? Who would like to go?
I can go. I can speak from the mental health world because that's the world I come from. I think in the mental health world, we're actually starting to speak about this. So this step one is awareness. We always talk about, the stages of change, right? Stage one is awareness, recognition that there's a problem and we need to work on it. So we're kind of in step one. So it's better than step 0. So we're moving along. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I remember when I did my master's program, there was one course on diversity and one course, actually, I think that was it. And yet in every single class, there was a little portion on diversity. And in every single presentation that we used to do, they had a portion where we had to talk about let's talk about diversity and how not everybody's going to experience this the same way. I feel like we need to do much more than just a little portion. So again, talking mental health, talking masters, post-education on counseling, that's where I did my master's. We are recognizing that there's an issue. We need to talk about it, but I think we have a long way to go. I think we're on the path. At least the circles that I'm in, we're on the path.
Thank you so much. Sam?
Yeah, I would agree that we are. If you're starting from a very low baseline, obviously it seems like there's so much more to go, but it's encouraging. I'm not speaking to anything specifically, but I think of how at the Oscars, the Oscar Awards, the Academy Awards, they had their first land acknowledgement last year, which on the one hand is encouraging. On the other hand, you're kind of, you think back in disappointment, like Hollywood is sort of kind of the most liberal progressive place in institution in North America. And 80 years of Academy Awards, only now are they acknowledging that the land that they're sitting on is there. But, you know, prior to the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, that really ripped open the Band-Aid. I think it really opened the eyes of a lot of people in mainstream society, white, but not only white, in terms of the impacts of racism and how that has affected us today. And you just look at any kind of example, you know, for on Monday it was Canadian Thanksgiving. In the US, it was Columbus Day. But we're now seeing in cities and states across the country, it's now being recognized as Indigenous Peoples Day. So these changes don't necessarily happen fast, and often they don't happen fast enough for people. But I think we do see it happening. And here in Canada, to use a local example, I mean, we had our federal election, and the MP for Calder or Griesbach is Blake Desjardins. He is the first two-spirited member of Parliament that we've ever had in the history of the country. So yeah, we're starting from a low baseline, but I do see encouraging signs in everywhere we're looking.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we have time for one more question from the audience is, do you know of any intersectionality materials or resources available? We can't share any materials through the chat box. We might be able to include whatever is said here in an email, but yeah, I'll leave it to you to tell me if you know of anything that the audience might be able to look up further.
Well, I would share that diagram. I think that people see of the boys watching the baseball game and they have the fence. I think everyone's kind of familiar with that one, but there's others that are also interesting. And I'd be happy to send them out. With this brochure, the Active Bystander, it's actually going to be going to print for November 1st. So if I can, I'd like to share that on November 1st, along with whatever resources I can think of that might be applicable for your audience.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that. I also put in the chat box Kimberle Crenshaw, anything on her really, because she is the pioneer, the founder of intersectionality theories. So there might be a lot of information in that regards. So Gan, is there anything that you can think of?
YouTube. I thoroughly enjoy, I love human behavior. I'm such a nerd. I'm constantly, oh, hi, Kitty. Aw, Kitty and I collaborated many times with shared files back in the day when I wasn't doing my own thing. So hi, Kitty. So YouTube, I thoroughly enjoy when I'm cooking, when I'm cleaning, to listen to people's stories on YouTube. So I just like will watch, like, for example, there's an author, her name is Sabrina Stings or Strings, I'm not sure, but she's on and she talks about how fat phobia is actually rooted in racism. And so that's something I just randomly found on YouTube one day, and I just like listened to theories like that. And so if you haven't checked her out, check her out. I don't know if it's Sabrina Strings or Stings, not sure. But yeah, fat phobia, she argues, is rooted in racism, and I think that's so powerful. But stuff like that, I just like will listen to people's perspectives and people's theories and these authors and TED Talks. And I think that creates more of an understanding, because you just look at the world differently the more you listen to people's perspectives and experiences and worldviews. I feel like you become more compassionate and kind in recognition that like everybody, whether it's somebody that you like made eye contact with a mask at the grocery store, or, you know, you're like pumping your gas and you just look, every single person that you see is going through something, has gone through something, like without fail. And I just think the more you listen to those kind of stories, the more just compassionate you become.
Great, thank you so much. There's some more materials and resources that are being shared in the chat box, so I invite you to look there. Any other thoughts, final thoughts on intersectionality that you'd like to mention before we finish our session?
I would just echo what Sogand said about, you know, YouTube and whatnot, because I think that's actually a great resource, is that there's and you know, whether it's podcasts or YouTube, there's tons of there's tons of resources out there that, you know, if you only have 5 minutes to listen to something, or you know, you got an hour to while you're driving to work or whatnot, there's a ton of places you can go to hear real people's stories, you know, listen to theories, whether they're academic or it's lived experience. It's just a matter of just kind of looking and spending some time to kind of, you know, understand other people's lives a bit better.
I do have one other question here from the audience regarding intersectionality, and it's, do you think young people are growing up with a naturally more intersectional lens?
Can I go, Sam?
I would say so.
Yeah, I would say so as well. I would definitely say so. I think that, you know, these kind of conversations, like when I was growing up, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't even know what inclusion meant. I didn't even know what diversity meant. I remember in like elementary, like as far as it went was people come in different shapes and colors. I remember that. Like that was like the biggest, the most progressive movement, which was powerful at the time, right? But I think that because of the power of social media, I think we always talk about the negativity, and there is a lot of negativity, but there's also a lot of positivity, which means like you get access to other people, other stories. And like Sam was saying in the beginning, yes, most stories have been written by very, you know, it's been very narrow, the amount of people who've been given the platforms to share their stories throughout history. Now we're hearing other stories. And so I do think that there might be more privilege for this generation to actually have maybe more, you know, access to things that the rest of us didn't grow up with because of social media. But I still think we have a long way to go.
Great. I do have one question. It's not really about intersectionality, but maybe one of you might be able to answer before we close off our session, is how to manage performative allyship effectively. Or is that just another can of worms in another conversation?
You know, it kind of is a can of worms, but going back to what Sogand was saying earlier about listening, oftentimes because you know, I'm on certain Facebook groups, I'm watching people and you know, participate, and oftentimes there's a lot of performativity. And my clue is to just listen and read and see and not say anything, and just see who else is, you know, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Because I think it's very easy to talk the talk.
Agreed.
I agree.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Any other questions from the audience? All right, so I do want to mention that our next session is on November 3rd on anti-Muslim hate in Canada, and the registration is open. It's been, the link is in the chat box for anyone that wants to register for that event. I want to thank the panelists with us today, Sam and Sogand, for all their knowledge and links back to intersectionality. Much appreciated. And thank the audience for the questions that they asked today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was beautiful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And we'll see you for our next session on November 3rd regarding anti-Muslim hate. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.